How to deal with artificial intelligence is perhaps one of the most pressing problems facing the modern world. But as I've been discussing with Simon Schaffer, we tend to look at artificial intelligence in isolation, and we ignore the crucial relationships between humans, the machine, and the society we are creating together. For the founder of the modern computer, Alan Turing, social and political issues, even questions of personal identity and psychology, were just as important as the brute facts of calculation and coding. In one of his most important writings, produced not long after the Second World War, Turing didn't just invent the famous Imitation game, he also mulled over the possible social consequences of this developing technology of AI.
Turing's paper on computing intelligence was very concerned, as a lot of his colleagues at the time were, in what we might call the uneven development of society, technology, intelligence, and social organization, in which you have this massive uneven development between the capacity to produce devices like this and the capacity to deal with them. So he was very interested indeed. You see that in the paper, and you see that in the other material that he wrote at the same time, as in, for example, this famous lecture that he gave to the London Mathematical Society, which is a work of absolute genius, where he's really talking, amongst other things, about the condition of people who serve the machine and the people who design it, and what you do with the outputs. And I think that's absolutely where we are.
We've become very good at producing the devices.
We're much better. We is perhaps not the word we should be using here. Some people based in California, and a much larger group of people, mainly based in China and South Korea, are very good at making devices that do that set of tasks. The question is, what about the uneven development of the social relations that surround those relations of production, and how this relationship is both extraordinarily unstable and deeply dystopian or unsatisfactory, right? It's clearly not maximizing human welfare, let alone the welfare of anything else. If you insist on the importance of looking at that set of networks, then the problems become manageable. If you ignore the fact that all of this is relational and you insist on the need to kind of consider the device on its own, its challenges and opportunities seem to me to become absolutely unmanageable, right? It is precisely, and you can go back to Turing and see this, it is precisely because he's insisting so rigorously on the mutually constituting relation between social relationships and, as it were, what's hardwired, that I think he's relatively optimistic in just the way that I would be if I was that clever, which I'm not, about the machine society. And it is the machine society of which he is writing. I mean, more or less explicitly. He talks and writes quite explicitly about the immense importance of making machines part of our society. That's his phrase. And I think that's an extraordinarily important phrase. Hardly anybody else was writing like that at the time. I mean, he was projecting from a world which was certainly not a world in which these kinds of devices were terribly well socialized. And again, I think there's an autobiographical aspect to that, because one should never forget the immense range of pressures under which Turing was acting. I mean, apart from his own personal politics, there's also the institutional politics, the Official Secrets Act, the ban essentially on describing anything about what he'd done and what his colleagues had done. I mean, anything, right? So that these pieces of writing, here I'm going to get a bit fanciful, these pieces of writing from 1948, 1949, 1950, 1951, which are an amazing body of work, you need to remember under what circumstances they're being written. They're not very far away from being a man corresponding remotely with a remote judge. Because like the Imitation Game, Turing is in the predicament of knowing much, much more than he can say. And he's extremely restricted on what he can say. And he's trying, as in the 1950 paper, to communicate to quite a large philosophical audience the lessons of work he cannot in fact describe. Yeah. Now that is not unlike the Imitation Game situation. It's very closely related, it's been argued by some, to the personal conditions in which Turing led his life. The fact that he was gay, the fact that he was under the most ferocious control over what he could say about what he'd been doing during the Second World War and subsequently. So he's projecting, I think that clearly this is not all he's doing, but he's partly involved, I think, in a series of quite remarkable reflections on how to communicate under constrained conditions. And then to suppose that we're always in that situation. We're always in that situation. Turing, after all, was giving these talks and writing these papers under circumstances where he was simply banned by law from describing any of the details of quite a lot of what he'd been doing. Not all of them, but quite a lot of them. And that is the situation of the Imitation Game, in which you're not allowed, for example, to show yourself.
No. And that's so powerful when you think of what Turing's personal life.
Yeah, and also his institutional setting, whether in the National Physical Laboratory or at Manchester. There were all sorts of things he could not say. He could not say.
In the next episode of this series, we go back 200 years and more to show how modern fears about AI aren't new at all. Even then, we were haunted by the thought that machines would soon replace us.
So you see images of automata in cabinet, or the House of Lords run by steam, or you see poets producing verses by machine.
If you want to know when the next episode in this series is available, please click the button below to subscribe. Thank you.